Good evening. I am Polly Trottenberg. I am the newest dean of NYU Wagner, and I am delighted to welcome you all to obviously what is going to be a fantastic event. Does when we're born make us who we are? A new way of thinking about crime and success in America. Tonight's event was organized in great partnership, NYU Wagner, the Russell Sage Foundation, and Vital City, our longtime collaborator. I have to give a shout out to Liz Glazer, who leads Vital City. He had the privilege of serving there. And probably many people in this room know this Liz is always modest. She gets a big share of the credit for the dramatic reduction of gypsying and crime and culture. So we're here tonight from renowned sociologist, author, and Vital City contributor Robert J. Sampson about his latest book. And copies are available in the lobby. Marked by Time, How Social Change Has Transformed Crime and the Life Trajectories of Young Americans. He'll be interviewed with the award-winning New Yorker Magazine reporter Adam Gopnik. In Sampson's 3-decade study of over 1,000 Chicago children, he finds that the era into which you're born matters as much as who your parents are. Children that are born a decade apart with identical backgrounds coming from identical neighborhoods can experience dramatically different life trajectories. So I'm personally very excited to hear tonight's conversation between Adam and Robert about this new book and all the public policy implications. Before that wonderful discussion kicks off, I want to call on our collaborators to say a few words, starting with someone I have the pleasure of introducing, Bruce Western, the esteemed president of the Russell Sage Foundation. Bruce himself is a world-renowned author in sociology of poverty and inequality. His research has examined the social and economic impact of criminal justice policy and incarceration. So we have quite an all-star cast with you here tonight. We're honored to have him. Bruce, come on up and say a few words. Thank you.
Well, this is a wonderful night, and good evening, everyone. So my name's Bruce Western. I'm the president of the Russell Sage Foundation. It is a real pleasure to be convening this evening's conversation between Adam Gopnik and Rob Sampson with the Wagner School and Polly and Vital City and Liz. So let me give you a quick 30 seconds on the Russell Sage Foundation. It's America's oldest operating foundation. It was established in 1907 with the mission of improving living conditions, social and living conditions in the United States. We're a research foundation, so we try and live up to this mission through social science research with work on poverty, inequality, immigration, work and labor markets in the United States. Now, a big priority for us is to try and promote public conversations between superb researchers and superb writers and journalists. So tonight is really a home run event for us. 30 seconds on our speakers. I know Liz will provide a longer introduction. When Liz told me that Adam might be interviewing Rob this evening, I was beside myself with excitement. I won't say much about Adam except to declare in this public forum my complete idolization of his writing. And I'm going to bore him, I hope, at much greater length over dinner. Adam, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. It's also just a real treat, and it warms my heart to be able to welcome my great friend and former colleague, Rob Sampson. Rob is a sociologist. He's a deep thinker, an extraordinary empirical researcher. If we had a Nobel in sociology, which we don't, Rob would be at the front of the line. So that's all I got, and welcome everyone, and let me hand over to Liz.
There are only about 14 speakers after me, so don't worry. Then we're going to get to the main. I just have a few housekeeping things. There's going to be a little bit of Q&A. We'll, during this thing, just keep an eye out. We'll hand out note cards, write down your question, and they will be collected. The other things are, obviously, get Rob Sampson's book, available for a small donation at the back of the room, or buy it online along with whatever book you think will tickle the algorithm online, be it Grisham or whatever. Read the fabulous Adam Gopnik always, and go see him tomorrow night at the 92nd Street Y, where he'll be talking about Georges Simenon and other mystery writers. And of course, read Vital City and subscribe. So let the games begin.
This is where they put me to interview Cate Blanchett. So I'll feel very comfortable being here. Rob, first of all, thank you for this wonderful book, Marked by Time. Thank you all for coming. We have a very cinemascopic room, so we will try and make eye contact left to right and then back again. I will say, as a non-specialist with a vengeance, that reading this book, even for someone as innumerate as I am, was a revelation. It's one of those books, put me in mind of Robert Putnam's writing on Italian democracy, or our mutual friend Howie Becker on deviance, that really, with the simplest of ideas, completely changes your view and understanding of an issue and a crisis you thought you understood. I thought maybe we would start, Rob, if it's okay, with some macro questions and then proceed to the micro questions, the micro discoveries in this book. First of all, as I said, this is a work of science, of social science, but it's an astonishing thing for those of us who are essayists and pundits of a kind. It's not your opinions. It's, it's actually driven by data, and data collected over a long time. Tell us something, if you would, about the specifics of the project, and more broadly, if you would, about what drew you to this kind of empirical sociology in the first place.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because you're right that the ideas in the book are deeply rooted in data, and a long-term study at that, something that I've been involved with for 30 years. I didn't write the book over 30 years. The ideas actually developed over time, and I'll say more about that later, because how were we thinking about the book at the time was very different than how it developed. So let me take you back to the beginning in brief. So this study started in the early 90s, and I was at the University of Chicago on the faculty there, and there was a large-scale collaborative group. So this is sort of big science, I guess you could say, in a way. And the funders, society, academics were really trying to figure out at that time how to deal with the epidemic of crime and violence. Because in the early 90s, crime was shooting up. It actually had been for a while. I mean, there was the rise in the 70s and 80s, but in the early 90s, things were really coming to a head. In fact, well, here in New York in 2000, it was the peak of murder, something like over 2,000 murders. In Chicago, it happened a little bit later. It's the second city. It was 1993.
We're proud of that.
Yeah, I know you are. But it was really, in all seriousness, a traumatic time. And we were planning the study at this time. And in 1993, right when we were sort of designing it, 1992, there was a particular incident, which I mentioned in the book. Actually, I have a picture of the spot where he was killed. A young boy named Dontrell Davis,
Yes.
who was just 7 years old. He was walking to
It's
school.
emblematic in this book.
Yeah, with his mother on a sunny day,
Right.
and was shot to death, murdered by someone trying to take out a gang rival member. And that kind of destroyed the city, but it was emblematic of the crisis of violence. Incarceration was going up. And so we designed this study, again, this large collaborative group, to try to understand the development of kids in the social context of the time. It was called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. And so the idea was kind of built into the name, that is individual development and then neighborhood. So it's kind of not pitting individuals against neighborhoods, but nonetheless, really trying to understand those two phenomenon. And that excited me. because my earliest work was on the life course of individuals. First book was Crime in the Making,
Right.
and it was about pathways and turning points through life. And I was also very interested in neighborhoods, and there were various disagreements actually about which was more important, and this was a way to kind of test and develop data to bear on these large-scale hypotheses. So the data collection in just 10 seconds was a monumental effort that involved enrolling about 6,000 children, actually a little bit over, at different ages, following them, at least at that time, over about 5 to 6 years, interviews with mothers and their children and other caretakers, collecting original data on neighborhoods, including surveys. We drove down the streets with video cameras to observe the streets. So it was a massive data collection. And we didn't know what was going to happen.
How many people approximately worked on the project?
Oh my God. So there were multiple investigators, I'd say 5 or 6 scientific directors, principal investigators, about 100 to 120 people worked on collecting data at one point, and that didn't even include the survey research firms. So it took a lot to carry that out, and we were lucky to get the funding, and I felt lucky to be part of this large-scale project. But what we didn't know, and what no one really could anticipate, is what happened just as we were starting the study and enrolling the study. In 1995, which is basically kind of the first year of data collection, that was the year, actually, I believe that the term super predator came into being, the coming super predator. And so again, gives that idea of what people were expecting. And I use that, and I use the example of 2 kids from our study, just as sort of examples. One I call Darnell, who was born in 1995, right? And he was poor and lived in, raised by a single parent in the highest poverty, one of the highest poverty neighborhoods in the city. And in a way, had all the risk factors that one suspected, a lot of people would predict, would lead to
a life of crime.
And I compare him to Andre, who was born in 1980, was less, graced by history in the sense that he had come up in the 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic, and was around 13 at that peak of violence. And so these are 2 kids. He lived in the same neighborhood, same race, same poverty, single parent. So in a way, you can think of it as the same
environment, broadly speaking,
that were walking into different futures. But at the time, one would think Darnell, would not live such a great life. But in fact, they lived very different lives.
And that's determined.
That's sort of using 2 people, but I'm not an individualist in the sense of it's not a narrative about these 2 individuals. It's the study of the cohorts to be able to make the argument that when we are born shapes who we become.
But I obviously want to talk about that in detail. And it's wonderful, though, in the book that you have those 2. Obviously, it's appealing to a humanist essayist because you can see the possibilities of writing the book through the 2 of them. So it's wonderful to have them. Just before we proceed to the specifics of it, just one more kind of broadly philosophical question. It seemed to me reading it that one of the kind of presuppositions of the book, the kind of foundations, is the idea that social experience is labile and changeable, that it isn't always fixed. Is it fair to say that that's a particular American tradition in sociology, particularly at U Chicago and elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at the changing environment, for example, particularly changing neighborhood environments, is a big part of the old Chicago school and a lot of my earlier work. But I think a lot of the research, at least in criminology and the study of what were then still called criminal careers and so forth, tends to really be rooted in a somewhat different assumption of sort of more of a stable propensity, if you will, or criminal character that sort of built into the idea of the super predator. And the book challenges that idea through being able to look at these cohorts coming of age in different historical contexts. And one of the reasons I argue that we haven't really been able to separate out the study of individual development and these kinds of social changes that were happening, for example, the great crime decline, the changes in arrest practices and policing, we'll probably talk about some of those, is that a lot of the studies at the time, and still actually, are single cohort studies following same people through time. And I've done that, and it's a wonderful device, really, but there's an issue with that, which is as we age, time marches on, right? And that's the notion of sort of the confounding, and I actually use the philosophical aphorism from Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, that no man steps into the same river twice, or it's not the same river and it's not the same man. So if there's this societal flow and there's individual change, what do we do?
Yeah.
Well, the design was looking at kids starting at very young ages, literally an infant cohort, women just had given birth 3, 6, 9, 10, all the way up to age 18, and follow through the same historical time, which allowed us then to look at kids coming of age in different historical circumstances. So really, I'm arguing for, and the empirical basis of the book is the intersection of individual change with history. And a lot of the work, too, on crime and punishment tends to be pitched at a very aggregate level, societal changes over time. That, too, is important, but that tends to leave out the individual and the intersection of the individual.
Well, let's go to the micro if we can,
Sure.
Rob, because in reading the book, it's the kind of the simple but profound conclusion arrives for us right here on page 84. It seems to me you're saying strikingly, in comparing panels A and B, which I won't show you, we see there is no material difference in the general pattern. The logical implication is that cohort differences in arrest trajectories are not confounded by the characteristics of the subjects, their families, or their early life neighborhoods, but rather are due to the strongly divergent historical periods through which the cohorts aged as adolescents and beyond. That seems to be the key notion. It's not where you're raised, it's not even by whom you're raised, it's when you're raised that is the crucial determinant, the crucial factor in shaping crime and its resistance.
That is the strong argument of the book, which is not to say that I don't think
the other
individual
right.
characteristics are irrelevant or neighborhood factors are irrelevant, which I come to. But yes, that's the strong version of the argument. So I'll take that figure that you just described. It's important to know one central fact about crime that's known as sort of the age crime curve, or sort of the age invariance curve, which is basically that for all kinds of data sources that we know, and even at different times in history in different countries, crime tends to go up, peaks in adolescent, late teens, maybe early 20s, and then goes down.
People age out of
age out, and this is important later when if we think about policy, because it's almost a law. I mean, I don't believe in laws, social laws so much, but in fact, there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that's true. So teenagers, in other words, are a problem, and all parents know that.
Right.
Now,
committed disproportionate amount of the crime of all kinds.
And a lot of other stuff too.
Right.
But the idea is that yes, teenagers are a problem, but when one is a teenager is centrally important. And so what you're talking about there is what we did is to look at age-graded pathways, or that sort of pathway through life, because we have individual indicators of, for example, whether someone was arrested at every age up until our oldest person is in their late 30s or 40s or something. So it's so we can look at their trajectories, and yes, indeed, goes up and it tends to go down, but at very different levels. And the kids from the older cohorts, kids that were born in the 80s, are trailing off at a much later point. And in fact, so I would say that in the figure you mentioned, I think it's something like 100% higher for the older cohorts. You might say, well, okay, that can be due to a lot of different things. Cohorts differ by composition, maybe economic composition, family structure, race, more super predators, propensity, we can go on and on and on. But we have really rich data that we can adjust for those things, and when we do.
And you control for
and we
all of
control
for all of those
things
variables,
and
right?
show that then still holds, it matters some, but the point is, that's a good indicator. So the argument goes that it's when, again, the teenagers are coming of age. So if you're 15, let's say in 2005, that's very different than being 15 in 1995. In retrospect, you can say, well, yeah,
Duh.
that's sort of
Yeah.
obvious, but then wait, but then why do we make all these decisions and
Right.
judge people outside of time, as
Right.
it were? And we don't really take it seriously in terms of, at least I think, in criminological policy and theories, that fundamental point. So yes,
Right.
it's this.
The first thing that one thinks about, if I can steal a bit of academic terminology, is that you de-essentialize crime in that way. There's not a criminal type in your universe. There are cohorts that are passing through that are more or less susceptible to criminal behavior. True?
Yes, that's true. And even if there were such a thing
Right.
as a
Criminal
inherent,
character.
you know, let's say a born criminal or
Right,
something like
right.
that, the manifestations of that would still vary by
Mhm.
historical context. So interactions with the police, for example, differ. The probability that you're going to be in a disputatious encounter, for example,
Right.
these all are shaped over time. So it actually can incorporate that. But the argument is that that historical moment, that historical turning point at that age is a fundamental
And
determining
even
factor.
things that are sort of part of the language of sociology, like self-control and so on, too, turn out to be susceptible to the same time gradients. Yes.
Yes, and in fact, self-control, people call it somewhat different things, grit or, you know, planning ahead or so on and so forth. But
Organizational.
self-control is a fundamental feature in a lot of, not just criminological theory, but actually how we think about success
Mhm.
in life. Those with high self-control tend to do better on a lot of things. Some people have called it the gradient of self-control in terms of income, in terms of all kinds of outcomes. And in criminology, there's a longstanding finding that low self-control kids are more likely to commit crime, more likely to be arrested. In our data, that's true. And we have what I would argue are very good measures based on behavior from parents, measured at different ages, and so we can compare. The key for me, the argument I make is let's look at it differently. What I mean by that is when you look at the self-control and, let's say, arrest relationship,
Mhm.
it follows that curve. And in all cohorts, the low self-control kids have higher crime. However, you can flip it around and say the manifestations of that, though, in terms of the prediction of, let's say, whether low self-control kid will go on to have a criminal career, differ in the following sense. For the older cohorts, the high self-control kids had the same arrest rates as the low self-control kids of the younger cohort.
Right.
You can almost draw a straight line across. So to me, that tells us a different story that's not contradictory. It's not saying, oh, self-control is an irrelevant characteristic, but it's asking us to look at
It's
it differently.
far more sensitive to birth date than one would imagine.
Yes, and the younger cohorts, the fact that they had the same arrest rates as,
Right.
Yep. What it means is if you track them out later on, then our predictions of how they're going to turn out,
Right.
again, this notion of a super predator, are just wrong,
Right,
and our
yeah.
predictions are wrong. I can get to that
Right.
too.
I want to go into, obviously, the great social question that raises is what changed between the cohorts. But just before we pursue that, because it's I know, a multifarious investigation, that what you've just described in broad terms, forgive me, but I'll translate it in broader terms, is kind of a approach to what we characteristically think of as right-wing approaches to crime, right? Some kids are born criminal, some people are born criminal, and that seems clearly untrue by any data. But then the book is also, in a way, a approach to certain things that those of us who are on the progressive side believe, because the data doesn't seem to show that socioeconomic circumstances are a neat determinant of crime.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Maybe to oversimplify, there's, maybe three views sort of. One is that there's bad people, there's bad character, wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to separate them. That was a famous statement that led to mass incarceration, so that there are just, bad people. Then there's what you might think of as the more, incentive-oriented, which is, it's the state in terms of getting caught, policing, incarceration that rules, or material conditions, or more of an economic view, right? And then the more sociological view, which I adhere to, which is more about social ties and social controls, and really more informal social controls. And yes, I think that over the course of the study, if you look at least at the aggregate level, the economic indicators don't really explain much, but that's also been true if you look historically. I mean, there's a lot of studies, not that there's no relationship, but in terms of GNP or unemployment, and when the kids were coming of age, the poverty rate, it didn't really map onto any consistent direction. And so really what was happening is that things were changing. First of all, in terms of policing, the younger cohort got lucky in terms of the collapse of the drug war, which is a little surprising, right? We think of mass incarceration and rising incarceration, but was actually declining in terms of arrests starting in about late 90s and 2000s. So for example, drug arrests dropped about 75% or more in the Chicago area. Disorder arrests, and you all probably know about broken windows policing and the idea that police should
talk about that, right?
Yeah, those kinds of arrests, public disorder arrests, dropped about 90% or more. So that's like a different social world in which kids were just much less likely to get arrested for doing things that kids do.
Yes, one of the interesting points you make as well is not only did drug arrests radically diminish, but the possibilities of making a good living in the drug market diminished at the same time. That the economy of drugs changed very much.
Yeah, I use the example of a sociologist who had done research in the South Bronx. Any here would remember the era of the South Bronx that was just devastated. The Bronx is burning, right? Famous statement Howard Cosell, I think, allegedly made.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning tonight. Yes, that's
exactly. In the drug war and
from Yankee Stadium, right?
Yeah, Contreras, who's professor now sociology, was sort of he was one of the 80s kids, but on the younger side. And
okay, just to explain, Contreras is one of the subjects who, because of his birth date in his cohort, went on to become not a drug.
Right, he was sort of a New York subject that makes the case, even though, I didn't study him in the sense that there weren't many years that separated him apart from the drug dealers that he and his friends, they thought they were going to get rich.
From older brothers and cousins, so to speak.
But then it collapsed. There was less money to be made. I'm not sure, or at least I would argue that I don't think their propensities were changing so much. It was that the world had changed and the South Bronx was improving and gentrifying. And that is part of, I think, the lesson that we can learn about what was happening to cities. There was this massive change and improvement in cities over a long period of time, actually.
Well, let's address that. Not to rush you through all of the beautiful gradations of data in the book, but it's the big question for those of us who are city lovers and city dwellers. What changed between those two cohorts? And in a broader sense, what produced the extraordinary crime decline? Your student, Patrick Sharkey, written about this at length. I've written about his writing about it at length in the New Yorker. In the course of the book, you look at the various hypotheses and try to evaluate them. Why don't we talk about some of them? You've already raised broken windows. Completely empty concept, or one with some residual?
It's a concept that I've not liked over my career, and I've written on it. You know, for one thing, the perception of what is a broken window varies a lot, right? Depending
Right.
on the context, if it's in a rich neighborhood or maybe a minority neighborhood, or whether you're higher income or lower income.
Right.
So it's, talk about essentialism,
Right.
that the perception is something that's highly variable. And there's a fair amount of research that suggests that the disorder itself, that is, those cues, are not what's driving crime. So I think,
So the theory was that if you stop people leaping over turnstiles and stop them from scribbling graffiti and so on, that would send social signals that would.
yeah, the original article, by the way, to give credit to Wilson and Kelling, who wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in 1982 on broken windows. If you read their original story, it was much more nuanced than what transpired after that. Like,
And the
they were
Bratton
worried
version of-
about
right.
the disorder and the fact that there was sort of a lack of informal social controls. And their idea was that the police should work with the community to clean things up and create better communities. Over time, that sort of morphed into much more aggressive policing, massive stop and frisk of kids, for example.
Which isn't
That's
isn't
not,
in
in
their
my view,
article,
that's
right?
not
Right.
broken windows policing. In fact, later George Kelling, denied it. Now, I think they have some blame in terms of, there are some things in the article that would lead you in that direction. But nonetheless, I think as a policing strategy, particularly the highly aggressive stops of youth without cause, is something that's not only leads to negative outcomes or collateral consequences, but is not responsible for the crime decline, in my view. Now, I mean, look, New York has its own story. We can talk about that. I think a lot of people would claim that it did, but I think the data are pretty clear that in terms of police size, policing, there are some effects, so I'm not going to write it off.
Right.
And targeted policing, particularly sort of what's known as hotspot policing in particular areas, seems to have some effect. But I think a fundamental issue to maybe put out here is that most crime control, and many people have written on this, is really pretty regular or sort of quotidian, or that it happens not because there's a police officer standing on the corner. It's the everyday regulations and controls that prevent people from committing crime, the social ties.
Community norms.
Community norms, or parents supervising their children, or community organizations getting involved.
Well, let's
fighting
explore
back
that.
in crime.
Explore that for a bit, because that in Patrick Sharkey's book, for instance, is seen as a very powerful source of the transformation. Community organization, building communities coming together to build parks where there were needle parks before, communities coming together to, in effect, independent of the police, to save themselves, and that those have huge payoffs. It's in the hypothesis you explore here.
Absolutely, and it's one of them. I think Pat's right in terms of that general argument, the transformations that went on in many cities. In a way, you can think of it as reclaiming urban space.
Yes.
Space that was just let go.
The triumph of the city is what.
Yeah, at Glazer's triumph for the city. You know, it's the no man's land kind of areas that we all saw that were walking around cities in the 1980s and 90s. And it was reclaimed in many different ways. And again, it wasn't just the policing, but in Sharkey's work, it's about community organizations. Important point there is that it's communities, what I call it in the book, is communities fighting back against crime. So it's a response to violence, but they're not unable to respond. And many community organizations, particularly ones that got increases in funding and that were focused on youth, showed declines. In other words, the decline in the crime rate that we saw, a good chunk of that can be attributed, using very strong methods, to community-based organizations. Another, which I think you're referring to, which I talk about in the book, has to do with something you might not think about as a crime control policy, which is cleaning up, let's say, vacant lots or greening spaces. There's really interesting work that's been done literal experiments,
Right.
so-called clinical trials, although in the streets, where abandoned lots that were, the sites of crime and people were afraid to go to them, they greened them and transformed them. And what happened? Well, people started to use those spaces, interacting. There were more eyes on the street in a Jane Jacobs way. People reported they were happier, more willing to interact. Crime went down.
Virtuous
Good things
cycles
Virtuous
began.
cycles. So if you think about it, like, that's just greening a lot. It seems too simple, but it's part of the overall argument that environments matter. And in this case, I argue in the book that environmental policy is
crime policy,
right?
right.
And degrading the environment and reducing funding for the environment is pro-crime policy. So.
That, of course, and when I reading that part of the book, I was put in mind of your friend and compatriot Robert Putnam, because there again, it wasn't directly addressing the problem of democratization, but all of the subsidiary and all of the foundational common enterprises that make democracy possible. In the same way, making a park better was a more effective way of fighting crime than putting one more kid in jail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You even take time to deal with what I had thought, I must confess, was a kind of a red herring, which is lead poisoning, and you write about that.
Yes, it's something that I had never, expected
Right.
to deal with. And there was a hypothesis that was put out there. There were strong claims made that lead was responsible for a decline in lead, de-leading of gasoline in the 1970s for the crime drop. I didn't believe it. And I still don't believe that it was the major cause of the crime drop. But over time, through colleagues and reading research, and a lot of research done by economists and my colleagues Chris Mueller at Harvard, historical data and lead pipes, there's something there. Why? Well, because exposure to lead is a kind of toxic environment, just like being exposed to violence, growing up in environments that are unhealthy. And in this case, lead poisoning is the kind of thing that was everywhere for a while. And kids eat, they eat dirt.
Flaking paint, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's lead paint, everything. So it's not just lead gasoline. And so work we did in Chicago with Alex Winter and others, looking at the blood lead level poisoning of kids in Chicago. And we were fortunate to get data through the Chicago Department of Public Health. They're one of the heroes, by the way, I think, in the book, because it was a disaster. I mean, there were neighborhoods where 70–80% of the kids tested had blood lead levels
huge level
above the dangerous level.
Right.
And it leads to all sorts of things in terms of impulsivity, problems in school, retention, educational dropout, delinquency, their health thing. And so the declines in lead exposure, I think, are really important, and they vary tremendously by our neighborhoods. And for the infant cohort, we were able to match at an individual level, and kids that had higher blood lead levels were more likely to be impulsive and have antisocial behavior. So the fact that there was this decline, which was, by the way, accelerated in the poorest communities, I think is a really positive news story.
Yeah.
And I have a chart in the book that shows, like, here it's up here at 90%, and by the end, in the poorest of poor neighborhoods, it's down near zero. And so that's a good story and a real fact.
Yeah.
I think it's part of it in terms but again, I'm not trying to explain the overall crime drop. I'm trying to explain how these kids coming of age at these different points
had different experiences.
Different experiences, exactly.
Right. And I found the lead part fascinating, exactly because it was such a vindication of empirical social science, because obviously it sounds like tabloid science when you first encounter it, but you really looked into it, and your team really looked into it and found that there was something in it, and you were prepared to Yeah,
I think you have to be open to surprises like that. And as I was saying earlier, even at the beginning of the study, it was going to be sort of an individual neighborhood. It wasn't until, 10 years or so ago, I really appreciated the vision of the multi-cohort design,
Right.
Because the change hadn't quite happened yet, and our kids were too young to have lived through that different world. So it took a while for it to come into vision, but it also took a while. The kids had to grow through that. And so if I could make a pitch for long-term social science of other studies as well, right? We always want to know, well, what's going to be the result now or next year? But I think investing in basic science is important. And these data have been used by a lot of different people. And, it will
Investing
live
in
on.
basic science. Whoever could challenge such a concept?
Well,
we want to take questions from the audience, far more erudite than I am. But let me push you, Rob, a bit. It seemed to me, taking in all of those factors, I inevitably and egocentrically was reminded of my own phrase, 1,000 small sanities, which I coined in the context of writing about Sharkey's book. That is, that there is no one cause, that it's a mistake to look for a monocausal explanation. The one we didn't discuss was, which is a favorite of conservatives, is just increased incarceration. That was a crucial determinant. That seems to hold little water.
yes, in the sense that incarceration has been studied a lot, and there was a National Academy of Sciences panel, Bruce Western was co-chair of, and Jeremy Travis, I think, is here, and many other research studies have basically come to the conclusion, it's not that it's irrelevant, but in terms of explaining the Great American Crime Decline, it's relatively modest. About 10-15% maybe of the decline can be attributable to incarceration, and then only up to a point.
Right.
And so, in a sense, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. It's like, well, if you keep incarcerating people and more, at some point,
right,
you're reaching a population that's less and less likely to be committing crime, and you're over incarcerating, and so
people who aren't.
It's inefficient, and the collateral consequences, which we know of incarceration, are quite negative.
Catastrophic, yeah.
Exactly. So I'm not arguing, and I mean, it's not a book about incarceration, right, although it plays an important part. I'm looking mainly at the entryway into that. You can't be incarcerated unless you're arrested, right? So the cohorts that were coming of age are younger cohorts. This is an important part of the story, right? It's a turnover. These cohorts are shaping the future. They're less likely to be arrested, and therefore they're less likely to be incarcerated, right, because that happens at a later point. The average age of incarceration is about 25. And so what's happening now is incarceration is rapidly dropping. In fact, we're in a really good place. We have lower crime and lower incarceration, partly because these younger kids have come of age and are now not committing crime, not being arrested. And people have made the wrong projections. I can say more about that later.
Please do. I could talk all night about the specifics, but I know everyone here would love to hear about what you write about towards the end of the book, and that is exactly what do we make of it? What do we make of it? What are the social policies that this long-term research suggests are sane and helpful? We've talked about ones that are not, or what are the ones that you would urge us to learn from this study in this book?
Yeah, I think there's some pragmatic things, and there's more conceptual things that in this environment are probably unlikely to happen. But
I think in this local environment.
Well, maybe here.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll go out and, rush the stage of the Congress. No. So prediction is a key element that the book addresses. And again, the notion that's built into a lot of risk assessment instruments, and the whole idea, there's a risk factor paradigm out there, right? And it tends to assume a kind of stability. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that there's sort of an unchanging relationship.
That version of social essentialism, there's an unchanging.
It's built in a lot of the algorithms that are being used, and of course, with the advent of large-scale administrative data sets, and now with AI, algorithms are everywhere, as we know, but they're being used in criminal history. Records are used for a lot of things. In the criminal justice system, they determine whether someone makes bail. Each stage that
You
determines.
write in the book that though propensity isn't supposed to be a determinant, it
That's
ends
right.
up being.
So legally,
it
and
ends up,
there's one chapter that's heavily legal, but it goes into the notion like, well, you're not really supposed to consider propensities like what you did, but actually, well, criminal history matters. And sentence, enhancement for people who've been convicted of let's say the same crime, but have a different criminal history, then that is enhanced. But what I argue is that the very criminal histories that are used, not just in the criminal justice system, but as it's probably well known, employment, tenant screening, many walks of life, that has history built into it, right? To the extent that the probability of being arrested is in that criminal history, then in a sense, you are making predictions based on when someone was. And we call this cohort bias. And if I can take just a second, because empirically, you got to make the case. What we did is to use prediction technology the way it's typically used, all the latest methodology, trained our prediction instruments on the older cohort, and then applied them to the younger cohort. What happened? We over-predicted by 50 to 90%. This is huge, right? This is, a difference of kind, not just of degree. It's a massive cohort over-prediction. Now, what do? At one point in the book, I said, well, the radical implication is just get rid of prediction. Let's just do away with it. But that's a road too far, probably. Right. Although others have argued for that. But there are things you can do. One, in terms of, look, we need to update our instruments. A lot of police departments, believe it or not, use older instruments. New York City is actually in the forefront of updating. Another is to consider the changing relationship of the predictors with the outcome. That sounds technical, but what it means is all the usual suspects, whether it's poverty, family structure, they, in our data, were changing in their relationship to the outcome. So in other words, that is not really taken into account. So we need to...
That it's constantly dynamic.
It's constantly dynamic. And so you're really in a quandary, right? Because you can't get too close to what you're trying to predict. You don't have any power. But I think these prediction instruments are doing real damage, and there's ways to train them better, I think. There's also ways that we can think about prediction differently in terms of things like cost-benefit analysis. Like a lot of programs are touted by saying, we're going to save X amount of money based on this program, but a lot of even the experiments that have been done, let's say on childhood intervention, were performed on the anomalous generation or cohorts of the highest
the
crime rate.
80s cohorts,
the 80s,
so to
which
speak,
means that the high benefits are unlikely to be yielded, which is really important at a pragmatic level, because I think a lot of governments and local departments are using these cost-benefit analysis to allocate resources to all sorts of things, including, by the way, jails and prisons. And I think there's been an overestimate of what is needed.
At a time when the need seems to be diminishing.
Paper coming out, and demographers have known this for a long time. But I mean, when you do the cohort analysis correctly, we can show, and others have shown that, incarceration is actually falling off a cliff, and yet budgets
for building
are
prisons.
Going up. Why is that? Because the mindset is in the sort of super predator logic, but it's also built on the prior cohort's history.
Right.
And so there are practical implications in terms of, like, I would, if I were in city government, insist that you redo those cost benefit analysis using more recent cohorts, or at least weight them and not be spending money foolishly.
That would be something. Let me turn to your questions. Forgive me if I don't get to all of them, but I know so many people in this room have something to ask. first question is, to your main point, while many types of crime are falling in New York City, assaults have risen, and an aging cohort of millennials are disproportionately involved. What are cities doing, and should cities be doing, for this older cohort we haven't formally thought so much about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So crime is down generally across the board. And I think I mentioned, actually I saw on the train coming down that in the first 3 months of this year, New York City has the lowest rate that it's ever had in its history. That is a remarkable statistic. I'm not sure what the assault statistics are, but oftentimes homicides are assaults that go wrong. And assaults are notoriously hard to measure. A lot of them are unreported. So it may well be, I don't have the latest data on assaults, that they're going up, but I still think the general trend of violence going down, including homicide, is true. And there is a shift in the age distribution, particularly prisons. Like older offenders are, we're seeing more elderly in prison. But why is that? Well, in part it goes back to the argument of the book, because of the sentence enhancements, for example, for people who have prior records. But since it takes time and you're at a later age when you're incarcerated, that's the older cohorts.
So it's a kind of vestigial cohort.
Yeah, it's kind of going on. In fact, it's sort of part of what I call the character trap, right? Which is using criminal history to impute your propensity or your likelihood or your criminal character, but then it leads to a vicious cycle.
Right.
And that cycle can be the denial of benefits or cutting off social ties or a longer sentence. And so we now have many more older offenders in prison than we had before, but the younger cohorts that are replacing them, they're not being arrested as much, and that's why incarceration is falling off the cliff. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So, of course, assault is a serious problem, and I would hope that it follows the same trend as the homicides, and I'm confident, well, at least if these trends continue, we can't predict the future perfectly, that they will.
Indeed. Someone asks, what about demographic decline? Chronicles of Culture from the Bad Old Days often featured single mothers with huge families, 9 kids in my colleague Susan Sheehan's Welfare Mother. Family size has plummeted. That's a major social change. Does that have an effect on crime?
Plummeting fertility in a way,
Yes.
and family size. That's a good question. Household size, actually, if we go back to the classical delinquency literature, living in a house with more sibs, you're more likely to be delinquent. That's sort of a long-standing finding. So you might predict that then that would be something that would lead to lower crime. I can say that we did take that into account, actually the household size and all that. And that didn't explain our cohort differences, so I can say that. The fertility differences, the demographers have done really interesting work on that, and there's been a real decline. One thing I think is useful to note specifically is that teenage births are way down. And that has often been an indicator of risk, right? And it kind of goes along with the fact that quote, problem behavior in terms of kids' delinquency and getting in trouble and drinking and drug use and teenage births and delinquency, these things have all followed a general downward trend. That's an important thing because they're all going together. It's part of a larger change in society. It can't be explained by policing, right? It's teenage births are going down. Something fundamental is happening, normative shifts and so on. And so I think it's a leading indicator, although the latest demographic research I've read is that teenagers are having fewer births, but we'll have them later in life, which is consistent. And so I don't view that as a warning sign so much as probably a rational approach to
I know
society.
we're running short of time, but let me let me pluck out a couple of more
Yeah, sure.
questions, because all of these are so interesting, and I wish we could do them all. Has your work, someone asks, covered the influence of abandoned buildings in the 70s and 80s? Have you compared the influence of housing that was created by the community in affiliation with the city as against, so to speak, the classic public housing projects? I think is what this is exploring.
Yes, good question. I haven't studied that specifically. There's been a fair amount of research on the destruction of public housing. For example, well, less in New York City. New York City has a very different tradition of public housing than Chicago, which was kind of a poster child for how not to build public housing. So Robert Taylor Homes near the University of Chicago, where I was for 12 years, was torn down. Cabrini Green was torn down. That's where Dontrell Davis, the young boy, was murdered. It's now, and I show a picture of it, an open space, green grass, new apartments, and so forth. Vacant homes, I think, is always been an indicator of blight. I think that's reasonable. Vacant homes are related in ecological research to crime rates, but there's not a lot, I think, that shows that that's a super important independent factor. It tends to be rolled up into multiple indicators of
It's a reliable
abandonment.
symptom, but not a...
Yes, exactly, like population decline, poverty, sort of the community disadvantage. These things tend to go together, and one of the reasons that vacant houses are problematic when it comes to crime, which is why Detroit raised many of them, was because they were then used as drug
crack dens and
so forth. And literally Detroit just raised many of them for that very reason and are building new housing. And so Detroit is actually
having
coming back.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to put it all on that, but I think that's an important thing.
One of those thousand...
If you think about reclaiming the urban environment, that's one factor.
to do it. Million questions to ask that the audience has, and I do too, but I know we're running short of time. So here's a question that I think is not a bad one to end on, though I'll add one of my own before we stop. So, the questioner asks, in a strong so underlined. So, and it might have added, so, Professor Sampson, what is the intervention that suits the time variable in reducing crime? In psychology, it's behavioral work. In biology, it's responsibility to negative feedback. In sociology, it's programming and social support. How do we counter-effect the negative effects of time?
Yeah, well, I knew the answer to that.
Shall we stop right here?
No, I mean,
but imagine, you had to give...
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. And at the end of the book, I mean, I do go through what I would call sort of the smaller interventions, that maybe the number of smaller things that you've written about that add up to be a lot, because I don't think there is a magic bullet, one thing, and that's what we're always looking for, that intervention. But these, good data on community based organizations, on different kinds of policing strategies. I think there has been improvement, by the way, in policing and community policing. And we're, again, working with the residents like they do in Boston. I don't know the current New York organization of community policing, environmental cleanup. But, okay, if you want, the big thing, I mean, look, I end the book a little bit on a philosophical note or conceptual note, which is, if we go back to the idea of character.
You also end it with a wonderful quote from Saturday Night Fever.
I did. As New Yorkers, buy the book and read about Tony.
Well, the quote is Tony at one point says, when someone is trying to give him good counsel for a better life, he says, "Oh, fuck the future." And the counselor says, "No, the future will come and fuck you."
Yeah. But I love that line, right? Because Tony was our low self-control guy. He just wanted to dance.
Right.
And so he didn't care about the future. And his boss, right, the future fucks you, because he wanted him to plan. But they both, in a way, were concerned about the future, or lack of concern. The future is unknown.
Right.
And so I take the character idea and push it a little bit to say, yes, the individual propensity, individual character is important, but we need to define it up. And what I mean by that is that the accountability or character, we can think about social character or societal character in cultivating that. And yes, it's somewhat abstract, and I've been called a bit utopian on that, but what is utopian? In a way, it's an ideal, and ideals are important, or ideas are important. And I think that where I end with the accountability issues, that moral accountability, in other words, it's not just individuals and the moral character of individuals. Why are we searching so hard for, these criminal character, immoral individuals? Let's think more about the morality of society, and I don't mean that in a religious sense so much as the collective responsibility for providing the social structures and the social controls that we need. And I think that is actually an important thing. In that, I even say at one point that the fact that we disinvest in many of the things that we know work suggests maybe our society has low self-control, rather than worrying about the
Low self-control.
Kids. But I think, by the way, not to digress, but one of the reasons I think trust is down,
Social trust in general.
social trust is down, is because, it's rational, because institutions have been failing us. And I think, particularly among the young, there's a sense that there needs to be more accountability at the level of institutions, particularly police, but also politicians and others. And so I think it's a broader based conversation about at what level are we going to think about character.
Yes.
And really pushing the social character side.
Leads me to
That's the high level.
Yes, the
Right.
last remark I had planned to address. We both are great fans, and we're lucky enough to be friends of Howie Becker, great sociologist. And the title of one of his books, which I think is one of the greatest titles in American literature, was "What About Mozart? What About Murder?"
Yeah.
By which he meant that that's the question every sociologist is confronted with. You're telling us that it's all about social variance. What about murder? What about people who are just bad? You're telling us aesthetics are all socially shaped. What about Mozart?
Yeah, and I kind of will answer how Howie did, right? Which is, well, yes, murder is wrong, because that's the trick, right?
Yeah.
Say, well, it's not important, but it's treated very differently, under very different conditions. There's all kinds of violence, whether it's political violence, whether it's individual violence, someone on the street who responds to an insult, versus domestic violence, versus stranger violence. These are treated very differently. And what Howie Becker was trying to do was not to say in a sort of totally relativistic way that crime doesn't exist, or, we shouldn't be concerned with those things. He's looking at the societal reactions to those things and how criminal records are established, which leads to what he called a master status,
Right.
which is one of his key concepts. And that master status is determinative of a lot of life outcomes. And so I think what he would say, and what I would say, is that, well, if we've seen, murder varies tremendously in its incidence.
Mhm.
It varies tremendously in how we treat it as a society. For a sociologist, that's the fundamental inquiry,
Mhm.
not so much the individual incident itself, and or some kind of dismissal of the accountability of an
Of the
individual for an act, because you can still, again, you can have two individuals did the same act, treated very differently, and then later on, let's say, if they came from different birth cohorts and had, let's say, a different prior criminal history for, let's say, drug offenses, which are highly
Mhm.
socially determined, their outcome is very different.
Yes, exactly. Well, yes, it's exactly was Becker's point, that in that legendary piece about marijuana smokers, that it sort of takes a nightclub to smoke a reefer, right? It's a social activity, and now you can't help but walk up and down the Manhattan streets and think, oh my God, the very notion that this was once
It's
criminal
weird,
behavior.
right? Like there's pot stores everywhere. There's people in prison for smoking,
Smoking
pot.
pot.
I mean, that's sort of an extreme example, but it's a good one. And there's
Yeah.
many other examples like that. And so the sociological view is trying to, meet in the middle to say, look, the social reaction to these things is crucially important. We're not saying behavior doesn't matter, but as we see, both are highly varying. And in terms of social change, I do think, again, one of the good news stories here is that both the reactions and the behaviors are trending in a very good direction.
Wonderful place to stop. This book will vindicate the value of sociology to any humanist for you too. Rob, thank you so much for your time and your attention. Marked by time. You can buy it on your way out. Thank you. Thanks. That was terrific. Thank you.